Steve, thanks for coming in today.
Thank you.
Don Brammer. Now, this is all about leverage, right? When you think about it, the Trump administration hoping this economic pain we've been talking about from the sanctions will bring Iran to the table, and we will get some sort of a new nuclear deal in place. It comes as the president's been suggesting economic pain from trade measures could bring China to the table on that issue. Now, the Chinese state media has been hitting back this week big time already, saying most recently that President Trump claiming to win on trade is, quote, wishful thinking. Let's go to Mayflower Fund's managing partner, Larry Glazer, also National Taxpayers Union senior fellow, Mattie Duppler, on the president using a strong economy as a bargaining chip. Mattie, you first. You think that works, that we're in a strong position to make these arguments here because of how our economy is performing?
Well, I would argue that the Trump administration certainly thinks it is. Look at what's happened in the past just recently with the EU. EU Commissioner Juncker came over here just last week to talk to the president and emerged with supposedly a deal that the EU and the United States were going to work out ways to lower their tariffs and lower their non-tariff barriers to have trade flow freely between the two countries. So, China is certainly in a position now where they probably are looking at what the United States and the EU has done and wondering whether or not they will be in a similar position soon where they will feel the need to come to the table with President Trump. And I think it's certainly a question with Iran as well.
As many similarities, as Mattie points out, Larry, that there are also a number of differences between, well, let's just take China and Iran. And looking at some of the footage of President Trump with Xi Jinping, who he says is his good friend right now. The Iranians, as Don pointed out, seem to have their back against the wall economically. Now, the Chinese may not be in great shape either, but I would argue they probably would be able to hold out for longer. We'll see. But I'll show you a chart of stock markets. Our market's doing great today. But if you look back to when the sanctions were put in place, steel and aluminum, S&P 500, the yellow line that we're showing on our Fox Business screen right now, is up about 5%, our stock market as a broad measure. The Shanghai Composite Index, which is the Chinese stock market, a broad measure of that index, is down 15% since that time. So the Chinese are taking a hit here, Larry. The question is, can they withstand it, and if so, for how long, right?
Look, there's no doubt. Look, we're in the dog days of summer, and it's hot outside, but the U.S. economy continues to be hot. And I think if you look at the sub 4% unemployment rate, you look at the GDP coming in above 4%, look at 80% of companies beating the profit estimates, you get very strong fundamentals. So the president is in a position of leverage here. And that chart and the stock market performance demonstrates and supports that thesis. And I think, look, we don't want Iran, or we don't want even the Chinese trade story to become a distraction from the pro-growth policies that are allowing our economy to grow. And I think that's what's really critical here.
Right.
Midterm elections, these are really, really important issues.
Well, hold on a second.
Really
are you arguing then that the president should be more focused on tax cuts and those types of things and not having these fights, even if he has the leverage? Is that your argument? Is that what you're saying, Larry?
Sure. Well, I think no doubt we want to stay on message here with the pro-growth policies, but it's important to galvanize the base if ahead of midterm elections. That's what Iran potentially does. Iran potentially brings those voters back into the fold to allow more of those pro-growth policies, to allow tax cuts 2.0, to allow some of the things that are driving the U.S. stock market. And I would also argue this, that some of the defensive nature that we've seen in some U.S. stocks, the move to small cap growth in the U.S., may reverse itself. You may see money go back into China after we make a deal with Europe and Mexico, because people perceive it's good for U.S. companies, it's good for global growth.
We need to get some sort of a deal in place. Wouldn't you say, Mattie? I mean, I don't know if it's Iran. It might be NAFTA, by the way. We started talking about this a little bit yesterday, that some people are showing or starting to see some signs that maybe we get something together on NAFTA. But go ahead. Looks like we need to get something in place.
Yeah, if you're president, you got to walk and chew gum at the same time. Larry's absolutely right. Those fundamentals are so important. Continuing to hammer away at the barriers to the economy that have kept pressure on the United States businesses is so important. That's why reforming the tax code, regulations, and everything else, the economic agenda that the Trump administration is pursuing is very important. But there's a global economy here that we need to be aware of. And there is investment coming out of China as a result of what we've done here in the United States. Foreign investment is continuing to rise here. So we'll continue to see that strength domestically. In terms of deals,
but the Chinese they're not waving the white flag tomorrow, the Chinese. I mean, even if they are in trouble, right? I mean, they can withstand it, or at least that seems to be the conventional wisdom, Mattie, for a while.
Yeah, here's the thing. China is a very different animal than the United States, right? They're a centrally planned economy. They're also a nation of 1.4 billion people. So China has needs that they know they cannot satisfy. They have energy needs. They have ag needs.
Sure.
And the United States supplies a lot of those needs. So they will start to feel the squeeze from some of these actions from the
I'll tell you
administration.
what they don't
The question
have,
is how long.
by the way, because and Larry brought up a number of times when he was talking about our country, Larry, they don't have midterm elections in China, as far as I know.
That's true.
You know what I mean? So they don't, they don't have that worry.
Sure, and you know what's amazing here is, look, it's incredible that we've been talking about Iran and China in the same breath. Iran is, from an economic perspective, is not even in the top 50 GDP.
It's a disaster.
It has an implication on energy markets. It has no economic implication to the U.S. in terms of trade. China is critically important. We're going to solve that puzzle after we solve Canada, after we solve Mexico. Europeans want to make a deal. These deals are going to come in. They're going to open up markets for U.S. goods and services overseas. China will come to the table after those other groups come to the table.
By the way, Larry,
that's where the growth comes from.
Looks great again today, right? I mean, because the thinking seems to be that, I guess, along the lines of what you're saying, that we're going to get these deals in place. I mean, for right or wrong, investors are writing off the worst-case scenario of some sort of a full-fledged, dragged out trade war. They just don't see that happening, right?
You know what's also interesting is if you start to see this reversal going on in the market where you're finally, after 10 years, you're beginning to see some value stocks outperform. Maybe energy does a little bit better as energy prices move up on these sanction news. Maybe financials do a little bit better as the yield curve steepens, demonstrating strong economic growth. So I think that's actually a good sign. There's some really healthy indications underlying economy here. We want to keep that going. That's what's really important, is make sure the policies support that economic growth going forward, as they've done over the last 6 to 12 months. And I think we just want to make sure when we get into the global stage, we don't do anything to detract from the domestic growth story, which is so important.
It is a good story right now, up 167 on the Dow. Mattie and Larry, thanks to both of you. We appreciate you coming on today.
Thank you.
Now, we're talking about, a growing economy, and certainly from a macro perspective.